Daf Yutes Amud Beis will begin Daf Yutes Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the bottom. Tanan Hasan. We learned a Mishnah in Masechet Edius. We learned in a Mishnah also regarding the din of Tumah Tahara in the Beis HaMikdash. Tanan Hasan, we learned Al Machat Shenimsa Babosa, that Rav Chanina Khan was made that if there's a needle that was found in the balsa, in the flesh of a korban that was shechted, Shasakin vayadayim hatahoras, that the knife that was used to cut the balsa and the hands of the kohen who was cutting, that they're tor. Va'balsa tame, and the balsa, the meat is tame. Nimsas b'perish, but it was found in the excrement called tor. Everything is tor. So this is what he was made. Such a case occurred that if the kohen, he shechted the korban, and he was cutting up the balsa, and he was cutting up the meat of the korban, and they found a needle over there in the meat, they found a needle, and they say, therefore, that the meat is tomei, but the knife and the hands of the kohen, and the kohen, they're tor. They're tor. So why is that? Why is the meat tomei? Why should the meat be tomei, and the kohen and the kohen and the sakin that they're tor? So Amar Rav Akiva Zachinu she'ein tumas yadayim b'mikdash. We see from here that the Rabbanan Dikadin of tumas yadayim, they were not geysered in the Beis HaMikdash. What's the din of tumas yadayim? The Chacham were geyser that hands can be tamei. Midaraisa, there's no such thing as hands being tamei and not the body. Either a person's tamei or he's tor. There's no difference between a part of the body. But the Chacham were geyser that since yadayim askoni is him, that people touch things and they might touch things which are unclean, etc., and then with unclean hands touch truma, it might make the truma disgusting, it might make it not royal achila, and it'll become to be mafsid the truma. So therefore they were geyser that there's a tuma on the yadayim, that the hands have a din of a sheni l'tuma. They have a din of a sheni l'tuma. And therefore, if these hands touch the truma, they'll passel the truma. They'll make it into a shlit, they'll passel it. So that will therefore prevent the person from touching truma with unclean hands. And therefore, he will be, before touching truma, be very careful, and he'll be nightly yadayim, and only touch it with clean hands. So they were geyser this type of tuma, they were geyser tuma on yadayim, and they were geyser that it's a sheni l'tuma. Now we see over here that this tuma, they were not geyser in the Beis HaMikdash. This gzera did not apply in the Beis HaMikdash, and we'll prove how shortly. So we have to go analyze this case over here. They found the needle. Now, what kind of tuma did the needle have? So we have to analyze what type of tuma was the needle. They found the needle, they found it in the meat, and what type of tuma was there on the machat? That's number one. Then we have to analyze based on that, why was the meat tamei and the kohen and the knife are tor? So that has to be analyzed as well. So the first point, the first stepping stone to analyzing this is firstly to establish, like Rabbi Akiva says, that the din of tumas yadayim does not apply in the Beis HaMikdash. Now another yesod in this din of tumas yadayim is that they were geyser that the hands should be a sheni l'tuma. The Rabbanan were also geyser that if a sheni touches mashkin, he touches a liquid, that makes the liquid into a risha. That the liquid, as opposed to becoming a sheni, becoming a shlishi, that liquid became a risha. So hands which are tomei is exerted the Rabbanan to sheni. They were geyser that the liquid that came into contact with the hands become a rishon. And therefore they were further geyser that if that water came into contact with even kalim, then that would be matama the kalim, which midaraisa it cannot. Midaraisa adam and kalim can only become tomei from an avatuma. They were geyser that if they came into contact with liquids, and this liquid now came in the contact with it, is also that it should be matama the kalim. Since liquids can easily be confused with the liquid of a zav and a zava, which are an avatuma, those type of secretions, those type of mashkim are an avatuma and can be matama on kalim, so they were geyser on other mashkim as well. So we have to analyze this step by step. So firstly, Rabbi Kiva says, Zachinu shein tumas yadayim b'mikdash. There's no tumas yadayim. That gzeir, they're not geyser on the base of mikdash. Correct. The Gemara v'neimu shein tumas yadayim v'kalim b'mikdash. Why don't we see from here that they were also not geyser the tuma the rabbanon of kalim? Because if they were, then we should say that the knife is tamei, that the knife is tar. Doesn't that show you that they weren't geyser this gzeira that the mashkim could be matama kalim, that they weren't geyser that in the base of mikdash? Where it says no. Amr Yirma Rav, V'Tamer of Yosef Rav Chanina, Yadayim Kalim Gzeres Kalim Shnishna. So the Gemara attempts to answer that, says that no, because you can't prove it from here, because maybe at this time the gzeira of the kalim had not yet been enacted. So you can't prove it from here because maybe that the gzeira derban was not yet in effect. Maybe at this point the gzeira of yadayim was in effect, and we see from over here from the fact that the kayin is Torah, that gzeira they were not geyser, but the gzeira of kalim you can't prove that from here because perhaps it was not yet enacted. Where it says no. Amarava v'atavai b'yam gazu. No, both gzeiras were enacted on the same day. They were on the same day when the Chachamim went up to the Aliyah of Chanayim and Chizkiah and Agaran, and they were enacted the Shmaya Asa gzeiras that we learned in Masechet Shabbos. And they were on the same day, so they weren't at different times. So if they weren't geyser the gzeira of Yadayim, why can't you prove over here they weren't geyser the gzeira of Kalim? This non, we learned that the gzeira that they were geyser that day are sefer, that they were geyser that a sefer Torah, that which if they put truma in a sefer Torah, it'll passel it. It'll passel the truma. Now, of course, midraisa it's not. But people used to put, the Amoratzim used to put truma in a sefer Torah and guard it there, and they said, this is Kiddush and this is Kiddush, so you put the truma in the sefer Torah, and then the mice would come and eat it and destroy it. So therefore, in order to ensure that they would not do that, they dafka said that the sefer is matama the truma, or passel the truma rather. So the geyser on the sefer vayadayim and the gzeira of hands, that hands are a shnila tuma, vatul yayim, and that a tul yayim passels truma. The Gemara says later that that is not in the list because that's midaraisa. And there are also geyser the gzeira of kalim, that oichlim and kalim that came into contact with mashkim which are tome, which are not an avatuma, which are mashkim that are tamei. They're also geyser that the oichlim kalim that came into contact to these mashkim should become tamei. So you see that it's all on the same day. So if you're going to prove from this case, from this halach over here, that the kohen and the knife is that they are tohar, well, if you're going to prove that they weren't geyser the gzeira of yadayim in the base of mikdash, you should be able to prove as well that they weren't geyser the gzeira of kalim in the base of mikdash. Elamar Rava, no. Why do we say it's the yadayim that we prove from here? Because hanach l'tuma sakin, that afilu b'chulin nami le'matame, that set aside the tomb of the knife of the sakin, because you can't prove anything from here from the base of mikdash, because even by chulin it would not be matama. Because as we're changing now our assumption from we had before, we assumed before that there was a liquid, and if there was a liquid present, therefore the liquid would be able to be matama the kalim. But now we're saying no, we're changing the assumption. There's no kalim, there's no liquid rather present. There's no liquid present, and therefore there's no liquid to be matama the kalim. So therefore, even with the rabbanon and even by chulin there would be no gzeir. So you can't prove that there weren't geyser this gzeir in the base of mikdash. It would not be matama because what would the knife have touched? If you say it touched the meat, so he was cutting up the meat, and there was the machat, the needle, the meat, and we're saying the meat is tomei, and now the knife is cutting the meat. Well, it wouldn't be. The meat is not going to be matama the keli. There's no tuma, and oichel is not matama kli. not midaraisa, not midarabana. Kalim are only mekabel tumah from avatuma daraisa, and even midarabana and eichos not metama kli. Vel the nagam machad. El you'll say touch the machad which is tame, the needle which is tame. Still, ha'ain kli metama kli. A kli is not mekabel kli, another kli, unless it's an avatuma, and we're presumably not dealing with a machat that is an avatuma over here, because then the kohen would be tame as well. So the machat was not an avatuma. So if it's not an avatuma, a kli is not matama kli, and even midurabanan it's not. So since there's no liquid over here, therefore you can't prove anything about that the gzera of the kelim, kelim that they weren't geyser in the base of Mikdash, because in Bechulon they wouldn't be geyser in this type of a case. But you can prove that the gzera of Yadayim is not, they did not enact it, because if they would, then we would say that the kohen would become Tomei. Since there's you have a needle that's in the base of Mikdash, that's in the body of the animal, he could have touched it, so we would have said that the kohen his hand should be, and we would treat it as tomei. So now the Gemara is analyzing this case further. So again, we found the machat in the behem, and we say the machat could have been tomei, and therefore the basar is tomei, but the kohen and the knife are tor. So hi machat mayavirate. What are the circumstances with this with this needle, and how could it be matama the basar? Inema sofik machat. If you'll tell me that the case is the machat is a sofik, meaning we don't know what the origin of the machat is, so we don't know the status of it, if it's tomei tor and the rabbanan were geyser tum on it. That's the type of machat we're talking about. I va'itma Rabbi Elazar Yosef Rabbi Chanina Chanamar loy gazra al sofik haroik and Shav Yerushalayim. That even though there's a gzera, the rabbanan on a sofik, if there's saliva, if there's roik. Now, we don't know if that roy came from a zav or a zava, it's an avatuma, or it came from someone who's Torah, such as Torah. The Rabban were geyser because of the case of Sophic, if it's because of the case of a zav or zava rather, that on a case of a Sophic roikin, they were geyser that it's Tomei. However, loy gazra Sophic roim Yerushalayim, but on Yerushalayim they did not impose that gzer over there. They didn't impose it in Yerushalayim. So therefore, you see, well, that's one case that they're not geyser, and and the other one says that this gzer that we had on Sofik Kalim, if you don't know the origin of the Kalim, they weren't geyser on Yerushalayim either. So therefore, we're talking Yerushalayim over here, and therefore the tumah of the machat in question cannot be as a Sofik machat and it's tomei midrabanan, because they weren't geyser on the Sofik Kalim in Yerushalayim. So Amar Yehuda Marav ki going shav daloi machat meimes v'kir b'basar. What we're talking about is that there is a machat of a tomei meis, and therefore the machat, if it touched the person who was a tomei meis, a machat is an avatuma, and it was lost, and the person recognized that machat and found it in the basar. Well, if that's the case, the machat would be an avatuma, and if that's the case, it should be matama not only the basar, it should be matama the kohen as well. So the Gemara will ask shortly that how can you say that that's the case? Because then the kohen would be tomei, because the machat would be matamim. But at this point, this is what we're assuming, that the machat was the machat, a needle of a tomei meis, the machat was an avatuma, and therefore it was matama the basar. Rav Yosef Rav Avin Amr different teretz. He says it says that the cow came from outside of Yerushalayim, and from the time that it came to Yerushalayim, it was chasum and it was muzzled. So therefore, the machat that it swallowed must have come from outside Yerushalayim, and therefore, even though they didn't impose the gzera of Sofik Kalim in Yerushalayim, but this Kali came from outside Yerushalayim, and therefore it's the gzera of Sofik Kalim. Now, according to this teretz, it comes out good. The gzera that they were geyser on the Kalim, Sofik Kalim, they weren't geyser on a case that the Kali should be an avatuma, because that's not such a common case. The gzera of Sofik Kalim that they were geyser is, they gave it a gzera and treated it as a rishon latuma. Therefore, the rishon latuma of the machat is midirabanan rishon latuma. It could be matama the basar, but it's not matama the kohen, because a rishon is not matama an autumn v'kalim. Even a Rishon D'Oraisa is not Matama out of a Kelim, and Midrabanan it's not Matama either. So therefore, the Basar was Tameh, but the Kayan and the knife were Tor. And that was the status of the knife. And as we said before, we're talking where there were no liquids, so therefore they would not apply the Gzera of the Kalim that they came into contact with the Rishon L'Tumah, that through liquids, a Rishon L'Tumah of liquids, and that will become Tomei because we are talking where there is no liquid on the Basar. So that is the explanation of the case, that it was a suffix, a machat, that it was a suffix. So the Midrabanan, it has a din of a Rishon L'Tumah. It was muzzled from the time it came into Yerushalayim, so that Gzera still applies. And therefore it had a din of a Rishon L'Tumah, it's Matama, the Basar, but not the Kain or the knife, and there are no liquids, and there are no liquids to impose the Gzera of Kalim. However, Rabbi Akiva says that you see that they didn't impose the Gzera D'Rabbanan of Yadayim, because if they did, then the Kayan, his hands would be Tomei. Gufa, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, Chad Amar Lo Gazer Al Safek Arakim Shrilayim, V'Chad Amar Lo Gazer Al Safek Kelim Shrilayim. So, Vrek the Gemara, why do they have to tell us this? Reik and Tanina. We learned the case of Reik and Kelim Tanina. We know these. L'chera, we've learned this already, and this said it's beferish. We learned it, and it's mentioned in different Mishnahs. Reikim Tanina we learned because we learned in the Mishnah the Snan Kol Reikim Nimsam Yerushalayim Tahar. All the Reik that's in Yerushalayim, they're Torah. They did not impose the Gzera Safek Reik Yerushalayim. Chos Mishal Shuk HaElyon, except in the upper Shuk. In the upper marketplace, that's where the Zovin and Zov, that's what they used to frequent. They stayed in that area. So there they said that the Safek Reik, you don't know the status of the Reik is Tomei. But outside of those areas, we don't attribute it to a Zov or Anida, and we say that it's Torah. So why do they have to tell us this? Gemara says, like they needed to tell us. So in a case, even though there was a chazak that we know that there was a zav in that area, still, nevertheless, there's a suffix on the saliva. It's torm. Kalim, in fact, more kalim tanina. Well, why do they have to tell us the case of kalim? We also learned it. It's not we learned kol kalim inside Yerushalayim. All the kalim that are in Yerushalayim, they're chirila beisat tefillah. If it's on the path leading to the beisat tefillah, the way they had situated is that they had the Beisat Tefillah, they had a path coming down, where the people who were Tomei came down, or with the Kelim or Tmeim, they came down one path to be Teva, and after the Tefillah, after the Tara, they came up another path. So what came down was things, or people that were Tomei, what came up was already after the Tara. So if you find Kalim derech Yeril Beisat Tefillah, if it's on the way down to the Beisat Tefillah, then on that assumption over there is or Tameim, that they're Tameim, because we assume that it is over there that they're Tomei over there because they're bringing it down to the mikveh to be Taiva, but make a diuk, how to Alma Tahir, but make a diuk that if it's not on that path, generally speaking, otherwise in other areas, they're Tahir. So why do you have to tell me that they did not impose the Gzer of Safek Kalim Yerushalayim? Don't you see from the diuk over here, from this inference, that the Kalim in general are Tahir? According to you, you can ask from the Seif. It says derech aliyah taharim. If it's on the way up, that's the taharim. The alma tmeim, make a diuk that the alma, if it's not from specifically the path that leads up from the Beisat Tefillah, that the tmeim. Ella, what must you say? Ella reisha dafka. Ella, to understand this, you must say, explain it, that the reisha is dafka, that only the kalim that are found on the way down to the Beisat Tefillah are Tomei. Generally speaking, you have a Safek Kim, they're Torah in Yerushalayim. The Seifa lav dafka, but the Seifa that says that the ones that are Torah are from the path leading up, it's lav dafka. It's not only from the path leading up, and generally speaking, the kalim are Torah. Well, afuke, I guess I said, but why does it say the path leading up? It's to afuke, to exclude the small alleyways, the small mavuas that people would go and go down to and from the Beisat Tefillah. Those small alleyways, there was no designated path what's going down, what's coming up. Over there, generally speaking, it's Tomei. But it doesn't mean only on the path leading up from the Beisat Tefillah. It means that path, and generally in Yerushalayim, that they're Torah la'afuke, to the exclusion of those small mavuos, that in those small alleyways, some kelim, safek kelim are tame. But it is needed to teach me that this is the pshat in the Mishnah, because otherwise I wouldn't have known this. Frank the Gemara ularav to Amar to go in Shavdullah Machat May Mace Veikirva Bolsa. Well, Rav said the case is that there was a machat, a needle belonging to Tommy Mace, and he found it in the Bolsa. Well, Kavan Domar, we learned B'Chalal Cherev. It says that whoever touches the body of someone that was killed by a sword, and we darshan b'chalal cherev harayu kechalal, that the cherev is like the dead body. So just like the dead body is avia v'setuma, the cherev, the sword, the metal that touches it, has the same din. And just like someone who was a tome maze is an avatuma, a needle that touched it would also be an avatuma. So if it's talking about a needle that belonged to the tome mace, the needle would be an avatuma. Well, if it's talking about an avatuma, adam v'kelim nami l'tame, it should be matama also on v'kelim, and it therefore should be matama even the kayin who cuts it. So why would we say that the kayin would be tohar? Omar Ravashi Zoisameres, we must learn out from here that Azora Rishus Rabbi, that we treat the Azora as a Rishus Rabbi. The Azora, that the people come and go over there, we treat it like a Rishus Rabbi. So therefore, the way the Rambam learns is that even if there happen to not be three people to say, Lagabe Tuma, a Safek Tuma Rishus Rabbi, we say you need at least three more people. Now, the Azora, we give it a status of Rishus Rabbi, even if there weren't three or more people over there. It has a status of a Rishus Rabim, and therefore we say, V'havlei Safek Tum Rishus Rabim, Chol Safek Tum Rishus Rabim, Sveigator. And therefore we say that it's a Safek and Rishus Rabim, and the Safek is Tor. Meaning, the case is, according to Rav, that it is a Machat of a Tommy Mace. He recognized it when he cut up the meat. The Machat is an Avatuma, but the question is, the Safek is, did the Kayin touch it? Since the Azor is a Rishus Rabim, Safek Tumah Rishus Rabim is Torah, and therefore we say the Kain is Torah. Break the Gemara. Well, let's make a diak. How Rishus Yachid? Will you make a diak that if it's Rishus Yachid Sveika Tomayu, that the Safek is Tomei? Well, why would that be? Even if it would be a Rishus Yachid, why would you say in this case that the Safek is Tomei? Now, even though generally speaking we say Safek Tomei Rishus Yachid is Tomei, but why would we say it in this case? Mifni Hay Machad Davar Shein V'Das L'Sholem. This Machad is an inanimate object. It doesn't have intelligence. It can't ask a question. Now, this din that we learn out that Safek Tuma is Tomei, we learn out from Saita. These are the principles of Tomei, that the Saita is unknown whether she was Mizana with this man, she was unfaithful to this man. We don't know, but the Torah says under the circumstances of a Saitim that she's treated as being Tomei, that she's treated, we treat it as though she was Mizana, which the Torah calls Tomei, and we say it's a Safek and she's Tomei. And therefore we learn out to all cases of Tuma that a Safek is Tomei. Now the case of Saita is a Rishus Yachid. She's secluded in private. There was Yichud in private. We learn out similarly that a Safek Tuma Rishus Yachid is Tomei, but Rishus Rabim is Torah. Now the case of Saita, however, is talking about a woman. It's talking about a woman who is Mizana with a man, so it's talking about someone's Eish Boy Das Lishol with human intellect. There we say Safek is Tomei, Safek is Tomei. But by the Machat, it's Ein Boy Das Lishol, so we should say, even Rishus Yachid, that it's Torah. V'chol davar shein boy das lishol, bein Rishus Rabim, bein Rishus Yachid, Sveika Torah, the Safek is Torah. So why would we say over here that Safek Tumah is Tomei? Mishum dahave Safek Tumah ba bidei Adam. Because even though the Machat is a davar shein boy das lishol, but this is a Safek whether the Tumah came about as a result of the person. It's a result of the person touching it. Did the Kayan touch it or not? According to Rav, that's the issue. We know that the Machat is an Avatuma. If the Kayan touched it, it would become Tomei. It's a Safek Tumah Rishus Rabim. Now, only in Rishus Rabim we say Safek Torah, because even though the Machat is Ein Boy Das Lishol, but the question is that the person who Yesh Boy Das Lishol, he had Das Lishol, did he touch it? According to Rabbi Yosef Rabin, it's not a question, the shaila is not did the kohen touch it or not. According to him, even the kohen Vadai touched it. It doesn't matter because we're talking about not a machat that was an avatuma. We're talking about a machat that was a sofek, and the Rabbanan imposed on it a din of rishon latuma. Even if he definitely touched it, a rishon is not matama. A machat will not be matama the other, so he's not tomei. So it's not a question of a sofek. But according to Rav, it's a machat, is an avatuma. If he definitely touched it, he would be tomei. But it's a sofek. Now, since it's a Rishus HaRabim, we say Sofek Tumah Rishus Rabim is Tor. But in a Rishus HaYochid, it would be Tomei. Even though the Machat is Ein Boidas Lishol, but the Kayan who may have touched it is Yesh Boidas Lishol. And therefore, we treat it as Yesh Boidas Lishol. V'om Rav Yochanan, he said, a Sofek Tumah Boa B'dei Odam, a Sofek Tumah that comes through the action of a person, we say Nisholam Aleha, we have to ask the Shaila, the shaila has to be brought to Bezdin, and therefore we say even if it was lying on the ground, meaning even if it wasn't the case where the person was handling it, and the question is, did he take this item and touch this item with something else? Did he he was handling the needle, for instance, and did he now touch it with a knife? Then certainly we would say that that's considered a yesh boidas lishol, even though it's an inanimate object, but it's a question of what the action of the person is. What did he do? But no, even if more than that, even if the item is on the ground, and the question is that the item is on the ground and a person was carrying a dead sheretz, for instance, and then he walked by it, did he touched the sheretz to this item lying on the ground? The person not even handling the item in question. The item in question is lying on the ground. But still, since the shaila comes up through what a person's actions did, the person's action involved in this to perpetuate the tumah or to create the tumah. Therefore, we treat it as yesh bodas lishol. So therefore, in this case over here, we would say that even though it's a shaila over here, the question is that the knife, the kayan, and it's a kayan, did he touch the machat? And the machat is an inanimate object, but since it's a shaila of what the kayan did the kayan touch it, we would treat it as yesh bodas lishol, and therefore we would say in Rishus HaYochid it's tomei. But since it's in the Azara, it's tor, and therefore we say that the kayan is tor, and the knife is tor. Only the basar that would be tomei in this case.